for taking the time to talk with me today. You've been such an inspiration to my work as a public innovator, and you've really set the standard, I think, for community engagement and for inviting people to come back into public life across the country. You've been called one of the great thinkers in American public life, and you've dedicated yourself to challenging communities and Americans to re-engage in the public square around our most challenging and complex issues. And you set the bar very high, my friend, and I thank you for that. I want to talk to you today about how you think about change and innovation in public life and how you approach these large-scale challenges. As you know, Accelerate Nevada, which is the initiative that I founded and I'm working on, that sits at the Nevada Community Foundation, is a research and policy institute. And we work on systems change projects. We are doing a large project now around making Nevada more competitive for federal funding, which would infuse our state with resources to improve quality of life. And we are also working on a veteran systems change initiative, which really intends to build an architecture across the state that enables veterans and families of the fallen to re-engage in communities also. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both those things when I ask my questions to you. As we work to mobilize the business and philanthropic, higher education, and nonprofit sectors, we are constantly talking in our state about dialogue. And I think this is something that you have really taken and sort of advanced across the country. And so my first question to you is, what is the role of dialogue in advancing policy issues? Some of these issues are so complex and complicated. How do you see dialogue as the main ingredient in moving these along? Yeah,
so before I answer that, let me first say thanks for having me.
Of course.
And congratulations on all the great work that Accelerate Nevada is doing. You know, this state does not get its fair share of federal dollars, so this is an important issue for the state. And I think on the issue of veterans and returning veterans, and you know, it's clear across our country that we're not doing enough, that we're not doing well by our veterans who have served this country. And so the efforts that you're doing are really pivotal. And my hope is that as that work continues to unfold here in the state, other people across the country will begin to look at what you're doing here as a beacon of both hope and a practical way to make sure that we're fulfilling our promises and pledges to the people who have served this country. First, let me say that I think oftentimes we do way too much talking and not enough acting. And so for me, I think of dialogue as a pathway to how do we produce the kind of action that reflects our values, our aspirations, our hopes for how we move a community or a state forward. So for me, the role of dialogue is, because you can't take effective action if there isn't agreement on a sense of purpose. If we don't understand, for me, we spend so much time when we do have dialogues focusing on problems,
yes,
or focusing on sort of these kind of blue sky visions that bear very little relationship to people's reality and the challenges on the ground. And so for me, dialogue is about, A, how do we understand our shared aspirations for what we're trying to create? How do we gain a sense of deeper purpose? Because what we know is if we want to take collective action, we need a collective sense of where we want to go. And it's not a vision, it's a sense of purpose, a sense of direction. And those efforts that have that tend to accelerate. And those efforts that don't launch with great fanfare, produce a lot of paper,
yes,
create a lot of meetings, and ultimately what happens is they break apart or they stall because they didn't take enough time up front to make sure that there was a shared sense of where we're trying to go. So for me, dialogue helps to create that sense of pathway, the sense of a common purpose, and then ultimately you have to deal with trade-offs. What types of choices are we willing to make in order to move forward? There's no free ride here. And for every choice, every desire to move forward, there are a set of choices that we have to confront and a set of trade-offs. And I think dialogue is really important in those areas as well.
So when you talk about collective action and the idea that underpins that, and I know now in your work you're moving into also really trying to seed and scale collective impact projects as well. Can you speak a little bit to what that means and how that translates some of the goals that we have into outcomes? How does that collective impact model make things real or help us realize some of the projects that...
Well, if we do it well, what it means is in collective action or collective impact, that we are acknowledging up front, first of all, that no one alone, no single organization, no single leader, no single citizen can create the kind of change that we need collectively. So number one, I think there has to be that acknowledgement, because collective action and collective impact is based on the notion that we need each other in order to move forward. But that's not even enough. So in collective impact, what we're saying is not only do we need each other, we need to create alignment between and among ourselves that we're moving in a common direction. Even though all our actions may not be highly coordinated, we understand that we're moving in a common direction. And so I think collective impact offers us, if we do it well, and if we do it right, and if we make sure that community is part of it, offers us the opportunity to do things that, but for acting collectively, we wouldn't be able to achieve on our own.
So how do you, when you look at some of the policy initiatives that we work on, and again, we're a Research and Policy Institute, so for us, we're always trying to underpin the actions with research and data. That's something that's very important to us, especially when you're trying to drive change at a legislative and policy level. How have you seen communities, when they've done this well, realize legislative or policy change without pointing fingers at government?
What they've been able to do, first of all, is reframe the question on the table. So right now in communities, and I think this is probably true here in this state and in other states across the country, we insist on framing issues in terms of problems. And as soon as we do that, people start to wonder, why haven't we made more progress? When they start to wonder that, they start to want to point fingers at one another and figure out who's to blame. And then they want to find who is going to solve this problem for them.
Right.
So we become, in a sense, a group of complainers, claimants, and consumers, right? The 3 C's in a sense. And that's a recipe for disaster and more gridlock. We Americans, at least right now, given where we are in our history, we're really familiar with gridlock and polarization and finger pointing. So those places that have been successful that I've seen have been able to reframe the discussion, not around problems, but around our aspirations, our shared aspirations. And what will it take for us to create the conditions and the pathways to achieve those aspirations? And then making room for people at the table to be part of that conversation. And then we have to hold ourselves accountable for what we need to do. But it doesn't have to degenerate into finger pointing. One last point about this, though. I said before, there are no free rides here. And so to create change means we're going to make ourselves uncomfortable, there's going to be dissonance, there's going to be tension. And just like we want to move away from framing things in terms of problems or these empty visions, I think we need to be careful not to run away from that tension and dissonance, because I think that actually is the seedbed for innovation. It's the seedbed for creativity, and it's the seedbed, if we manage it correctly, it's the seedbed for breakthroughs. And I think in a lot of cases, that's what we need.
And I remember I struggled with this concept at first, but you were talking about the concept of risk and being willing to take risks and to fail in public life, and especially fail when leading initiatives. And I was struggling with that at the time. And so as you talk about being willing to enter into these spaces where there is discord, what does that mean, being willing to fail and to own that to you? I think that's a powerful concept.
Yeah, I think it means a few things. One is, I think, if we want to create change, there are certain prerequisites. One is there has to be a desire within us for change. And I think dialogue can help us sort of uncover that dialogue, make more sense of it. The second thing, I think, is you need to be willing to make yourself vulnerable. Because in order to create change, and particularly if you're talking about collective action or collective impact and the kind of work that you're doing at Accelerate Nevada, you have to be willing to make yourself vulnerable, because by definition we're saying we actually don't quite know the answer yet.
Right.
We actually don't know what the configuration of our efforts needs to be quite yet. We will ultimately, but we don't know yet. We haven't heard all the voices and the competing voices on some of these issues. And so to enter into that space, one has to be willing to make themselves vulnerable so that they're willing to hear other people, they're willing to try out different ideas, they're willing to acknowledge that maybe the efforts they've tried in the past didn't quite do the trick, because otherwise why would they be around the table now, right? And then I think, yeah, you need to be willing to fail. And the reason for that is this: if we simply needed to do better planning, we would have had the answers by now. Right? We're all pretty good planners.
Yes.
We're all pretty good planners. I think the challenge before us, like on veterans or on the federal support that you're seeking, or on other issues I'm sure that you'll take up in the coming years, the question is in part planning, but I think it's more about innovation. Mm-hmm. And if you look at all great pathways to innovation, there's always failure on the pathway, because you try something, it doesn't work, you recalibrate, you try something different with the knowledge that you gain by being vulnerable and being willing to sort of think about things differently. And so this pattern keeps repeating itself until you find the right answers. Mm-hmm. And even when you find the right answers, you're going to have to continually recalibrate as you move forward. So to me, that means that you have to be willing to take the risk to put yourself out there. Mm-hmm. You have to be willing to take the risk to listen to others. You have to be willing to take the risk to realize somewhere along the path that you have to change what you're doing, because maybe conditions change or you learn something new. And look, we Americans don't like to fail, right? We don't like to fail. But, Thomas Edison failed a lot, right? Abraham Lincoln failed a lot. All the great people we look to, Jack Welch at General Electric failed a lot. And so I think we've got to get more comfortable with that idea.
Yeah, you had mentioned in something you had written a while back, saying that a lot of times it's not creating the new shiny project or program, it's simplifying. And so sometimes innovation comes from simplifying some of these complex embedded structures. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I think when we think about innovation, our initial thought is it's got to be something new, it's got to be something shiny, as you said. And I think we often think that the greater complexity, the smarter we are, right? So there's an equation, an implicit equation at work, which is, we all want to look smart and sound smart, and so we want to make things more complex because that suggests that we are. I think of innovation very differently. I think of innovation as, are we willing to entertain certain types of questions? Like, what do we really know about our communities and people's shared aspirations, and what does that tell us? What are the potential pathways for moving something forward? How is it that we create the conditions that create a kind of enabling environment that supports the kind of change that we need? And when I look at the kinds of things that are happening in communities, oftentimes it's not the most complex, complicated things. Mm-hmm. It's simple ideas that are really clear, focused on the right levers, bring together the right people, and try to create impact in a way that makes sense. And so, look, the world, the communities in which we're working are highly complicated systems, organic systems. Yes. So I think what we need to think about is, and as soon as we put something out into the world, it's going to get more complicated because there are more people interacting with it. So for me, what becomes really important is, do we have clarity of complexity? Do we have clarity of purpose? Do we have clarity of what the levers are? Do we have clarity about the right pathway? And if we can create simplicity around that, we have a much greater chance to succeed in the real world.
Mm-hmm. I think that's one of the most difficult challenges when dealing with legislative change or governmental change. It seems like there's the inner circle of complexity and technical knowledge, and then there's the community will on the outside that wants to impact some of those pieces, but in some ways they feel left out of the process because there's almost an inside language. It's like inside baseball. They don't understand, like you said, all the levers that are being pulled. And so how do you, when you're dealing with, I know you've worked, I think it was in New Mexico on a large scale child welfare project that had policy implications. How do you mobilize people that feel like, or communities that come back and say, we've tried to impact this issue. For example, the federal funding issue we're working on. We've tried this for 10 years, and every time we go up against this, we lose. What changes? Where's that tipping point in a community where they feel like they will be empowered this time, or they have the power this time?
Folks who live in communities, as we're living our daily lives, we're not experts
Right.
on issues. We're not experts on the sort of the technical dimensions of issues.
Right.
We're not engineers in any sense. And I think one of the things that I think sometimes we confuse is people's desire to be part of a solution with believing that they want to make all the technical decisions, and therefore we need to engage them on all those technical questions. And when we do and they don't understand them, we decide that, well, actually they're not as smart as we thought they were, or they think they are, and so let's just go do it on our own.
Right.
And I think what I would say is there are certain things that engaging communities around is really important. Questions about aspirations, questions about values, like what do we really value in this community? Questions about, when you're talking about children, parents may not know the pedagogy to teach kids reading, but they sure do know what kind of kids they want to raise. They sure do know that they want their child and other kids to have a fair shot at the American dream. They sure do know that they want their kids to respect authority and to engage with one another in respectful and dignified ways. Those are the things that create a sense of direction for where we need to go. I think on the policy side, what needs to happen is people who deal in policy need to understand those values and shared aspirations and how they get then translated into more specific technical either policies or other kinds of programs and initiatives. And so they need to be married up, but one doesn't replace the other, right? So the community can't replace the technical knowledge.
Right.
The technical knowledge can't replace the community.
Right.
This is the way our government and communities have been set up since the founding of the country.
Right.
And I think if we can understand sort of the division of labor, in a sense, we're much more likely to tap into what different groups have to offer, put it together, and then move forward. And I think where people get frustrated in communities, going back to your question about the tipping point, is a couple things. One is when people think that they're being engaged but no one's listening,
Yes.
right? So more window dressing, more lip service to communities. People have had enough of that.
Yeah.
And I think those groups and organizations and leaders that continue to trade in that kind of lip service will lose their credibility and ultimately may even lose their funding because they're going to lose support. I think what people want to know is that I've been heard and that you're taking into account what I value and what I've said, not that you agree on everything I've said, and nor that you will necessarily follow everything I've recommended. So there's a sense of transparency and fairness and a stewardship that actually people are looking for.
So 2 more questions for you. One is about philanthropy. How do you see philanthropy driving innovation in this space and supporting innovation? I mean, sometimes, you talk about boundary spanning innovation or organizations and how they can really knit together different players in a community. So bringing together academia or business or faith-based communities. How do you see philanthropy providing a catalytic role in communities to support this kind of work? And where have you seen that be highly successful?
I was just in Seattle talking to the Gates Foundation, the Seattle Foundation. I think they've got an initiative called the Roadmap Project in the southern part of Seattle and King County, and they have their challenges, but I think they're moving forward in terms of ensuring that there are adequate educational opportunities for all kids. I think what they would say, what I've noticed in other communities is, and I just spoke about this at the Aspen Institute to about 220 funders, is we need funders to pry open spaces in communities where they and we can convene the different players and different actors in communities to figure out how it is that we want to move forward. I think philanthropy can provide the seed money, the seed support, to engage communities and to engage leaders and groups and policymakers in thinking about where it is that we want to move and how do we articulate our shared aspirations. I think philanthropy can play a really critical role in this innovation process. But that's going to require change on their part because most philanthropists and foundations that I've encountered actually don't like to fail.
Right.
And so even though we all talk about innovation and talk about moving things forward,
Right.
Foundation presidents tell me all the time, they're definitely afraid of failing.
Right.
And yet, they actually have the resources we need to innovate. And many of them, if you read their brochures and websites and listen to their speeches, they're actually talking about innovation and the need to innovate. So there's going to need to be a shift there, but I think philanthropy can play a really critical role. And then fourth, I think the kinds of changes we need in communities, whether it's around veterans or getting federal dollars or education, philanthropy will never have enough resources to fund all those things.
Right.
Those resources have to come from other sectors, it has to come from the public sector in some cases. And so the question there is, can philanthropy support the process by which we actually marshal those other resources,
yes.
right? And can they be sort of one of the catalytic players in saying, we'll put some money on the table if you'll put some money on the
yes.
table. And not only that, we will support the efforts to get to the larger systemic policy changes.
Yes.
Because that's in part, in a lot of issues, where we need to get to.
Yes, and that's the role philanthropy has played for us, was just that little bit of seed money that allowed us to engage with the state and academia to start to get at some of these really difficult problems, and it was incredible. My last question for you is, you've been on the ground in Nevada for a number of years, how we originally met, I think 7 or 8 years ago, and my question for you is, what inspires you about Nevadans? I mean, what do you see here? You've been all over the state, you've worked with downtrodden communities, Detroit, many different places. And I've heard you speak about Nevada, and I'm always fascinated by your insights. What do you see as we start to craft a narrative? And I think we have been in Nevada after the downturn. We've sort of started this new Nevada narrative. What do you see as our assets? What do you think is inspirational about Nevadans?
Well, one is, I think, a lot of people came to this state looking for a second chance in their lives. And I think that is a deeply American notion. That we believe that you can always improve yourself. You can always have another shot at the American dream. You can always, no matter how many times you've fallen down, you can always get back up. And so I think there's a resiliency here and a sense of can-do spirit here that existed from folks who were born here and then folks who have now moved here. So I think that's one thing. Second, I think there's kind of a, if I can say this, there's kind of a manifest destiny sense here, which is, we're still pioneers. Yeah. We're still making our way. And I think that's really exciting to me. You don't have, like some other, let's say, Rust Belt communities, you don't have the kind of civic infrastructure that needs to be undone and rebuilt. In many cases,
right.
You're building it.
Right, it's tabula rasa.
Right? It didn't exist,
yes.
And people are saying that we now need to build it. And so that's a different kind of opportunity. You have, in Las Vegas, for instance, you have this juxtaposition of the Strip and then the rest of the community, right? And so how is it that amid this phenomenal economic engine, people can make their own way and you can actually knit together a community that exists within the Strip but also beyond the Strip, right? And so I just find a kind of can-do spirit, a sense that we're still creating something new, a sense that we're not afraid to try things, and to me, that's a spirit. Last thing, that's a spirit we need to renew throughout the country. I think it exists here. So I often look at this state and say, this state actually can help the rest of us figure out some things that we've lost along the way, right? And while this state is moving forward and creating, I also believe it can be a beacon of hope and demonstration to the rest of the country about how we renew ourselves, how we reclaim our spirit, and how we decide that we too need a can-do narrative and a can-do spirit to make change happen in our communities and the rest of the country.
Well, you've said that before, and there are many of your public innovators running around
right.
all over Nevada doing your good work. And like I said in the very beginning, you've been such an inspiration to me personally and to so many of us here. And I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. And I look forward to working with you long into the future.
Absolutely.
So thank you
Thanks
so
for
much,
having me.
my friend.
All right.
Thank you.